Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for the third session of this year's Crucial Conversation series on challenging AAPI hatred. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for this series. Our presenting sponsor, Texas Instruments and Texas Instruments Foundation. Thank you so much for your leadership in the community and helping make this series possible. And our series sponsors, IMA Financial Services and IMA Foundation, Nissan Foundation, Bank of Texas, and Mavs Take Action. We are very grateful for your support of the museum and this important series. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our community partners for tonight's event. JC Dallas, Dallas Dinner Table, Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas's Jewish Community Relations Council, League of Women Voters of Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. We are so grateful for your partnership and your support. And as always, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our museum members, board members, and volunteers watching tonight. We couldn't put on programs like this without you. We're so grateful for your support. If you are interested in becoming a museum member or volunteer, please check out our website, dhhrm.org, to learn more. The goal of our Crucial Conversation series is to create a space to discuss pervasive, important issues in our country and beyond. In the museum's permanent exhibition, we address U.S. history through the lens of American ideals, reality, and repair. Through our exhibitions and programs like tonight's, we acknowledge the reality of the American experience for so many of our citizens and residents and discuss how to work toward the ideals on which this country was founded. In this year's Crucial Conversation series, we aim to foster an increased understanding of the origins and history of discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S., to discuss the recent increase in anti-AAPI violence and rhetoric, and to identify concrete steps that can be taken to confront and disrupt AAPI hatred. In our first two sessions, we learned about the history of AAPI communities in the U.S. and the deep roots of anti-AAPI racism. Tonight, we will discuss the rise of discrimination and hatred in recent years. We'll leave time for questions at the end of tonight's program, so please use your Q&A button and we'll get to as many of them as possible. And because tonight's talk is so important and covering so much, it may run a little longer than usual. We're recording this session and it will be saved on our DHHRM YouTube page, so you can always come back to it if you need to step away at any point. And now I'm pleased to have such an esteemed panel with us tonight. I want to leave them as much time as possible, so I'm just going to introduce them briefly. Angela Hsu is counsel at Bryan K. Blayton Paisner, representing a range of both domestic and international public and private companies. She served as president of the Georgia chapter of the Organization of Chinese Americans from 1997 to 1999, was the chairman of the board of the Georgia Commission on Equal Opportunity from 2015 to 2021, and was president of the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association from 2020 to 2021. Manju Kulkarni is executive director of the AAPI Equity Alliance, a coalition that serves and represents the 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County, co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, the nation's leading aggregator of COVID-19 related hate incidents against AAPIs, and a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. She was recently recognized as Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential individuals in 2021, along with the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate, Cynthia Choi and Russell Jung. And Karthik Ramakrishnan is professor of public policy at the University of California, Riverside, executive director of California 100, and founder of the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside and AAPI Data, a national publisher of demographic data and policy research on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. He also founded Census Legacies, which builds on the foundation of census outreach coalitions to build more inclusive and equitable communities. Our moderator tonight is Elizabeth Mayung, KERA's digital producer. She came to KERA from New York, where she worked as a CNBC fellow covering breaking news and politics. Before that, she freelanced as a features reporter for the Houston Chronicle and a modern arts reporter for Houstonia magazine. I'd now like to turn the discussion over to our wonderful panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mary Pat. I just want to say I'm super grateful to be here for this conversation. I want to say thank you to our panelists for the really important work that they're doing. So to kick things off, I just want to ask, could you each speak briefly about the work that you do and how your identity has kind of shaped what you do? Angela, how about we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I was thrown into this work a little bit by circumstance. In March of 2021, I think most people know that there was a shooting in Atlanta of AAPI women. And at the time I was the president of the Asian bar locally. And there was a lot of attention focused on our community all of a sudden. So something that sort of had been going on for a long time, as my two co-panelists can tell you, when it hit Atlanta, it finally, the AAPI, the issue of AAPI hate really started to draw attention nationally. And so that's how we were in this community drawn in as leaders within this community. We were asked to speak to these issues.
And Manju, what about you?
Well, first off, I just want to thank the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for inviting me to participate tonight, and a special thanks to Mary Pat, Annie, and Caroline, and really just such an honor to join you, Liz, along with Angela and Karthik on tonight's panel. So for me, AAPI Equity Alliance, we're a membership organization. We've been around since 1975, serving our diverse communities in Los Angeles, really in a whole host of arenas as our community experiences health and mental health inequities, issues around environmental justice, housing and economic development, as well as really civic engagement and working in that arena. So for us, this work began, understanding and knowing our history. We've been aware of issues of discrimination and racism for that entire history. But what happened in February 2020 is that one of the staff of our member organizations alerted us to the fact that her son had experienced COVID-19 related hate. Keep in mind, February 2020 was before we had a single confirmed case of COVID in Southern California. And yet this middle school child was on the schoolyard at an LA public school. Another kid approached him and said, "You're a COVID carrier, go back to China." And when he responded that he was not Chinese, just simply to say, of course, he couldn't go back since he wasn't from China, the other child punched him in the face and head 20 times. And so as we became aware of this issue, we knew right away we needed to do something about it. First off, we worked with the family and the school district to make sure that their needs and the child's needs were being met. And secondly, we held a press conference with local officials to really make the statement that hate would not be tolerated in Los Angeles. And because we were able to get some media attention, Russell and Cynthia reached out to me from Northern California to say that they too had seen similar types of incidents. Right away, we reached out to the Attorney General, then Javier Becerra, to ask and really to demand that the office investigate, these type of incidents. And they told us that they were not in the business of collecting data, of looking at this, other than what local law enforcement does. And so we created Stop AAPI Hate. Just within a few weeks, we got several hundred incident reports. Now, as we approach, that 2-year mark, we're at 11,000 incidents from all 50 states in the District of Columbia.
So I'll actually take one step back to this question. At least the way I interpret it is like what brings me to this work and how my identity shapes that. So I'll say first, I'm an immigrant to the United States. So I was born in India and I lived there till I was 10, and then moved to Canada, then to the United States, and grew up in the Northeast in Massachusetts, in a place where people assume is like a haven of liberalism and tolerance. That was not my experience growing up in high school, unfortunately. And I've actually written a piece related to that for CNN a few years ago, including being taunted and being told to go back where you came from, right? I mean, that kind of refrain of Asian Americans being seen as that perpetual foreigner, people who have divided loyalties, people who are shouted down or being told to keep quiet and not rock the boat and not critique our systems. That was unfortunately my experience in high school, and it's not an atypical experience. I moved out to California after graduate school, and my dissertation and work has been on immigrant civic engagement, and not just looking at Asian Americans or Asian immigrants, but comparing Asian Americans to Latinos, to Black immigrants, to white immigrants. All of these immigrants exist in the United States, right? And so that's where I got my early work started in terms of using data and evidence to help inform a conversation, to have a reality-based conversation, as opposed to a stereotype or myth-laden conversation. More recently, starting in 2008, I was one of the co-principal investigators of the National Asian American Survey. It was the first national representative survey of Asian Americans. And then after the 2012 election, we saw sustained media interest in Asian Americans. What we saw in 2008 was a significant interest before the election, and then it dropped off. We thought a similar thing would happen in 2012, but there was some sustained media interest afterwards. So that's when I decided to start API Data, for it to be a clearinghouse and a resource for a variety of audiences, including journalists, including nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and others. So in terms of what brings us into this work, it's that data, and it's not just me, but other social scientists that are trying to bring demographic research and policy research to bear, to make it accessible, and to make sure that there is public recognition. Final thing I'll say is more recently, we adopt this framework called DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And all three of those are important when we talk about not only Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, but even other communities that are underserved, marginalized, targeted, et cetera. We need to have systematic data, but it doesn't stop there. We need to have community voice that is empowered to speak up on its own and not rely on others to speak for them. And then finally, it needs to be tied to strategic action, whether it be government investment or private investments, change in policy, change in practices. And we're just really honored to be, in the company of organizations like API Equity Alliance and others who, they are the strength that gets brought to bear. And one kind of classic example of that was in California. It took the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition, including API Equity Alliance, and a bunch of other, over 150 community organizations, working with the Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus and the Asian Pacific Islander Commission that I chair statewide, we all came together literally in a matter of days after Atlanta put together a $162 million investment package that is, an important step in making sure that our community's voices are being heard and our needs are being addressed.
That's great. I always like to hear the background of, how you all came to this point. So that's wonderful to hear. So we know the first two sessions of the series kind of explore the historical foundation of this conversation, including how systemic racism has affected AAPI communities in the US. And of course, despite civil rights legislation, this discrimination continues to persist today. So I'm wondering, what do you all see as the biggest challenges that AAPI communities face today? Manju, if you'd like to start.
Sure. So, what I think, there are a number of challenges, there's no question. I'll focus on a couple that are related to the lack of awareness or really some of the attitudes and perceptions of our community. The Asian American Foundation, as part of a project they have called Launch, did a survey of Americans and found that 1 out of 5, even in 2022, blame the AAPI community for COVID. So you can see really the impacts of the dangerous, hateful rhetoric of our prior president and so many other elected officials using terminology like Wuhan virus, China virus, Kung flu, and really weaponizing the disease and its transmission really against AAPI communities. When you think about what, and you talked, Liz, about that historical context, when you understand how we've been seen as the perpetual foreigner, you understand how those two things go hand in hand, as you have really what is fertile soil in America for this hate against our communities. And then you have a seed that is planted by political officials that then grows into the hate that we have. The other is just simply not knowing and even understanding our community. There are 24 million of us, and just by context, there are about 47 million African Americans, 60 plus million Latinx, 7.5 million Jewish Americans. So you see that we are sort of, firmly ensconced in terms of the population of the United States. And yet, that same survey that I mentioned, 50% of Americans could not name a single Asian American, not one, like a famous person, right? So the top answer was no one. The second answer was Bruce Lee, who's been dead for 50 years. And the third answer was Jackie Chan, who is not even American. So that gives you an understanding of what we're dealing with in terms of sort of the broader understanding of the community. And then more specifically, understanding our issues. Now, in May of 2020, when we celebrated API Heritage Month, a full 30% of Americans, of white Americans, had not even heard of the hate that we're talking about today. So I think this raises for us, when we think about how we develop policy solutions, those come out of hopefully a democratic process. And if people don't even know and understand our communities or our concerns, that becomes difficult to do.
Yeah, and I do want to pick up on what you're saying, and also what Karthik had said earlier about this idea of foreignness, that if you look at in what the series is about, if you look at the history of Asian Americans, the greater Asian American group in the United States, that this idea of perpetual foreigner has really been the cause of what's been dangerous for our community. I mean, you can kind of trace that thread from 17 people that were hung in California. And you can, kind of connect that with what happened to Vincent Chin now almost 40 years ago, and what happened after 9/11 to Muslim Americans. All these things are related. And so this sort of idea of perpetual foreignness can feel like it's benign. Okay, people ask, complimenting you on your English when you've lived here all your life, or you've spoken English all your life, but it can also really just turn on a dime and you can be scapegoated that easily. And so, my message to our community is that, we're American. And if anybody treats us as any less than fully American, like that's the kind of behavior that we really need to call out. But during this sort of wave of interest, call it, after the shootings in Atlanta, the two themes that kept on coming up is, the one hand, people really identify us immediately as being immigrants or foreign, so you're very visible, but our issues are invisible. So it's that contrast that, that Manju was also talking about, like this idea that people don't really understand, and our community is complicated because there's so many different groups that sort of come together to make that. Historically, it was, I'd read that it was, some UC Berkeley grad students that came up with the term Asian American in the first place, and they were trying to bring this coalition of different cultures together. So it's complicated. But I think the reality is that people outside of community often misunderstand or do not understand, and also this sort of our issues are masked by the veneer that our community is very successful, the model minority, that is, that term is kind of used aggressively towards other minority groups. And also for us, it masks all the problems.
Yep. One thing I just wanted to add to this, and I think it's just important to name it for what it is it's exclusion from whiteness and this assumption that being American means being white. Because when you look, you've had other immigrant groups, most famously during World War II, you had Japanese Americans that were interned, but not German Americans. Today, you see Asian Americans being targeted, but not Russian Americans, right? Even during the height of the Cold War, you didn't have the kind of vitriol and hatred. During the 1990s, when there were some campaign fundraising scandals, the Democratic Party returned money that was tied to Asian Americans, but did not return money that were tied to Canadian Americans and British Americans. So this is a pretty deep vein. So on the one hand, when you talk about foreignness, it's true. I mean, we are a majority foreign-born population, but we are held to a different standard than other foreign-born who don't have their membership questioned all the time. One of my colleagues at AAPI Data, Janelle Wong, I think she's a 5th or 6th generation Chinese American, and still, in different settings gets treated as a foreigner. So that's where it goes a bit deeper, where it goes to the core of what some people believe America to be, which is not necessarily a country of ideals, but a country with a particular ethno-religious identity. And this is where we're talking not only about communities of color, but also Jewish Americans being excluded from that definition. For a lot of Asian Americans, myself included, the last few years have been very sobering. If you believe this notion, right, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, it's almost this kind of evolutionary view. But what we're seeing now is some of our highest ranking leaders portraying a vision of America that is based on ethnicity and religion and very exclusionary. And that's something that we need to be not only mindful of, but recommit ourselves to combating, because that is ultimately very dangerous and corrosive to the foundations of our society.
I do want to add one thing, about like flipping the script on the idea of an immigrant, someone who's an immigrant. And like, to me, if you ever ask someone about their immigrant story, how they got here and how hard they had to work to be a US citizen, like my mother, it took her 4.5 years to get her green card. And then my dad, and we didn't see my dad until I was 9 years old. He didn't come to the country until she got her green card. If you kind of peel back the surface of people's immigrant stories, like they should be honored as the best Americans because they've earned their right to be here. Like they worked so hard to be here, and the sacrifice it took to be here to change the trajectory of our families. And so I just I like all this kind of anti-immigrant. There's a lot of anti-immigrant periodically kind of popping up that feel. And it just really, to me, it's like, is that especially on the heels of July 4th, I feel like we need to flip the script on this because like we've earned our right to be here. We've worked really, really hard to be here, and we're like more American, I think, because we really treasure it and value it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to say that we're more American, but I would just say that these are the civic ideals of our country, and that we have to keep returning and reminding people that that's ultimately, if not who many people think we are, like that's where we need to return to, because the alternative of somehow feeling that you need to believe things in a certain way or look a certain way in order to be. So that's one final thing I'll say, and this may be a bit of a repeat lesson for those who've attended the past sessions. This notion of who is Asian. So Jennifer Lee and I have an article called Who Counts as Asian? We actually have some survey data that shows where Americans, and including Asian Americans, think, who they think of as Asian. People like Manju and I are less likely to be thought of as Asian, even though now Indian Americans are the second largest Asian American group, right? So you have these very kind of rigid notions, right? But part of what defined Asian, part of what is common for someone like Manju and I, right, with Angela and Liz and so many other folks historically, has been exclusion from whiteness. Two famous Supreme Court cases in the 1920s that defined that no matter how light-skinned you were or how Caucasian looking you were not considered white and therefore ineligible for US citizenship. We also had like this major set of bans that started with China and expanded to the rest of Asia, and expanded and stopped at Afghanistan and Iran. Arbitrary boundaries, right, in terms of what it meant to be Asian. And that's what we're living with today. Look at the US Census Bureau. It does not include Iran and Afghanistan in the definition of Asian, but it starts with Pakistan, where British India was, and sweeps all the way up to Japan.
Definitely. And kind of going off that idea of the perpetual foreigner that you guys keep talking about, one of the clearest recent examples of systemic discrimination is 9/11. I know Angela referenced that. So could you all speak to how there was an increase in hate and racial profiling of Asian Americans after 9/11?
Manju, do you want to take that, especially in this Southern California?
So at the time of 9/11, I was actually on the board of directors of the South Asian Network, and I became executive director there a number of years later. And what we saw is really the targeting by our government, right? So one thing that's really important in the context of today's conversation, it's not simply about interpersonal attacks, but actual institutional policies that are driving much of the hate. And we think of it at Stop AAPI Hate as very broad. So one example I'll give you is the program known as special registration. And under that program, 85,000 Muslims and some South Asian Americans were essentially required to register. These are men over the age of 16 who are from Muslim majority countries. So 85,000 had to register just simply because of their religion, right? So when was the last time we saw that on the planet? was, of course, in the pre-Holocaust times, when the same thing was required of Jews under the Third Reich. And of those 85,000, 13,000 were placed under deportation proceedings. Again, simply because of their religion. How many incidents of terrorism were found? Exactly 0, right? So we see that even though I know, a number of folks have given President Bush a bit of a pass because he visited a mosque after 9/11 because he made a few comments. And yet the policies of his administration with special registration, with the Patriot Act, with programs that involved FBI surveillance and profiling, NSA profiling on a mass scale of thousands and thousands of Muslims, just again, simply because of their religion. I think that created a context of hate. So we don't even have to go back to the Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese American incarceration. It's within our own lifetimes that we've seen our government do this against its own residents and citizens.
Yeah, and the thing I want to add to that is what we saw, right? Absolutely, right? The government agencies, federal agencies for the most part, but to some extent local and state agencies that were also doing that. I mean, in addition to that national security entrance-exit registration system, the kind of infiltration of places of worship, right? And really destabilizing a lot of these institutions. But beyond that, you also had hate incidents. So the first person killed after 9/11, the following day, was a Sikh American in Arizona, right, at a gasoline station. And there have been, not a year goes by when you don't see Sikh Americans being targeted and killed. Before Atlanta, several years prior in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, one of the most horrific incidents in a Gurudwara, right? And even after Atlanta, some Sikhs who were part of this FedEx facility in the Midwest that were murdered. Some of it is because of the fact that Sikh males wear turbans, and when you had these images played on repeat, not only with Bin Laden but prior images of Ayatollah Khomeini and others, Sikhs are living as a very kind of persecuted and targeted religious and ethnic minority in the United States. And so that's something that continues even today. And part of my hope, and this is a kind of just important for us as a community when we talk about this tremendous diversity, that we are there every single time that this occurs. And Manju, I don't think I've said this to you in the same meeting before, but I've certainly talked about it to a reporter. To have someone like Manju, who's a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, even though nominally this is something that is affecting East Asians more than South Asians, I think is important and powerful. It's not just when our own smaller community gets attacked that we stand up and speak up and rise up. And I think I'm just grateful to have a forum like this with the Holocaust Museum here, so that we realize that it's going to take cross-racial solidarity for us to beat back these kind of ugly forces that are being unleashed and increasing in volume and intensity.
We also saw in the US that there was a really sharp increase in anti-AAPI rhetoric and hate incidents after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I know Manju talked about that earlier. So could you guys talk a little bit about what spurred that rise?
Yeah, I think Manju, are you going to share some data?
I am going to share some data, but certainly, I think what would provide nice context, Karthik, is AAPI data's survey in terms of really helping us understand how significant the problem is.
Absolutely, yeah, happy to do it. So what we did in right after Atlanta is we repeated questions that we had in the National Asian American Survey in 2016 to see, if there had been a shift and what those shifts look like. And what we saw was certainly an increase in the incidence of hate. We've repeated the same question wording just so that we could be sure that that is what is going on. And we found that close to 1 in 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had experienced hate since the onset of the pandemic. Importantly, we found that East Asians were the ones most likely to say that they had experienced these incidents. But we also found that Southeast Asians and South Asians had also experienced it, albeit to a lesser degree. Pacific Islanders, right, who are not Asian, many of them are non-immigrant, also experienced hate incidents. And that's, I think, just, some people say, well, is it Asian American hate or is it API hate? Well, the thing is, Pacific Islander communities are also being targeted. And this is where I want to go back to this notion, even if the supposed justification is this virus, coming out of China, it hasn't. Basically, what's underlying it is this very exclusionary notion of who is American, and lashing out and targeting anyone that could conceivably be thought of, not only is responsible for this, but responsible for a larger decline in America. So I think that's important in that data. And there are, our data compares it across racial groups as well. So African Americans are among the highest when it comes to hate incidents, sadly. And on top of that, their encounters of discrimination are not just interpersonal, but also when it comes to law enforcement. And that's something that we have to kind of deeply understand and figure out how do we combat this, is that racism is something that's experienced by all of these different communities of color, but it manifests in different ways. How can we build an agenda of solidarity that recognizes each of our differences in terms of how we confront racism or how we experience racism, but are able to band together and support each other in that work? Final thing I'll say is that we repeated that survey this year, and we found that those rates remain elevated. And if trends continued from the first 3 months of this year in 2022, it could be the highest levels ever, in terms of our communities facing hate. And we have other data, including hate crimes data from the California Attorney General, which shows that increases continue.
Manju, I know you have some slides. Would you like to share those?
Yes, let me do that. 1 second. So I just have a few slides that I'll share here about what we've received in terms of direct reports. I hope you all can see that. Great, terrific. So between March of 2020 and December 31st of 2021, we received just under 11,000 reports from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Let me say that we're actually going to be issuing our next report just in the next week or two, and that goes through the whole 2-year period. And so what we've seen is that 62% of those reports come from women. So the data, at least for us, shows that women are experiencing hate in disproportionate ways in the community. Youth also in high numbers, 10%, and seniors, that is individuals over 60, are reporting about 7% of those incidents. And let me say too that we did an elder report that came out in May looking very specifically at the impacts on our seniors, on seniors in our community. The other thing that is quite remarkable is that most of these incidents are happening in places and spaces open to the public. So you see there that just under 50% public streets, parks, sidewalks, and then 30% at businesses, right? So we need to think about what this means for us in terms of some of the solutions. Let's see. And so when we think about what that discrimination is, verbal harassment is the most common example at 63%. Then second most common, but significantly less in number and percentage, are physical assaults. And let me just say too that thankfully, most of the physical assaults, at least reported to us, are those that don't result in significant bodily harm. So they're throwing of bottles or cans, light pushing or shoving, unlike those most horrific incidents like the ones in Atlanta, like the one in Indianapolis, or even in New York or San Francisco and Oakland. And let me say too, what's important is a majority, in fact, a vast majority of incidents, while traumatic and harmful, are not crimes and therefore not hate crimes. So I say that as a former civil rights attorney. We review every one of these incidents, and so we know that these are largely not hate crimes. We see that avoidance or shunning make up 16%. And then those civil rights violations, workplace discrimination, refusal of service, being banned from ride-hailing services and transit, and online harassment. Again, this just shows where these incidents take place. Most notably, beyond the streets, sidewalks, and businesses, you see that schools and universities, we think make up a smaller percentage only because during, over a year of our data gathering, schools were closed. They were largely remote, and classes at the university level were virtual. You also see there that about 1% come from hospitals and medical practices, which is so concerning during a pandemic. And then this is sort of the last demographic slide. You see that a plurality of folks are Chinese Americans, but we have also other Korean, other East Asian communities, Korean, Japanese American reporting to us, Filipinx, Vietnamese from the Southeast Asian community. Even those who identify as biracial and white make up 7% of the respondents or complainants. And then, as Karthik mentioned, we do know that South Asians and Pacific Islanders have experienced this from AAPI data. Often those numbers are similar, but perhaps because they haven't thought of themselves in the same way, or the discrimination they face as being anti-Asian or anti-API haven't necessarily reported to us in the same numbers. So we're certainly working on outreach to those communities. And this is really my last slide here. We know that racial discrimination affects all parts of our community. Intersectionality, of course, also matters. I mentioned before that the vast majority are not hate crimes, and so a one-size-fits-all solution is not going to work. Also, a very, very important point, there is not one profile of perpetrators, and contrary to popular belief, to what's been shown in mainstream media, African Americans do not make up a majority of those causing harm. In fact, Janelle Wong, who Karthik mentioned, has studied the data, not only from our source, but other sources, to show that what we know already, which is that perpetrators come from all communities. And lastly, what we've been talking about today is the fact that these are not just about interpersonal attacks, but also structural decisions and institutional policies. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to ask a follow-up. Are there any groups that are being disproportionately targeted? I know that you had a slide 7 or something like that, but I guess are any of them being disproportionately targeted?
Yeah, I will say that, of course, what we have seen is East Asians perhaps more than other Asian populations. But, what is evident is that often, perpetrators get identity wrong, right? They're not experts in ethnic makeup or phenotype. And so it really, at the end of the day, doesn't matter. But the problem still remains, which is that we're seen too often as perpetual foreigners. And then with that, and then combining it with the transmission of the disease, we're getting blamed really in significant ways, causing harm to each and every one of us. Angela, I know you wanted to say something.
Yes. So yeah, thank you for those. Those are great slides, and for the work that you and Karthik do in terms of gathering data, because I think that's sort of it's so important to surface that information. But one of the concerns that we had right after what happened in Atlanta, it was very dramatic, and all of a sudden, like, everybody descended upon us. Like the New York Times and all these different news outlets descended upon us. And so, there was a lot of talk about it being an inflection point for our community. But, my concern is, even though these incidents continue to happen, we've to some degree stopped talking about it. There's a little less attention on it, and it's almost like it's sort of disappeared, but it's still happening. And so, the work that the two of you do in terms of collecting this data is so important, and the conversation we're having today is so important, because the awareness of it just isn't there. For a few weeks, and running into kind of AAPI History Month, that Heritage Month, that later that year, there was a lot of discussion about this topic. But then, they're just a little bit quieter now, and and these stories are not making the top headlines. I mean, it really, like, sadly, it takes a shooting. It takes people actually dying in a very dramatic way to draw attention to the issue.
Yeah, the thing I want to just add to that was, and I think, and maybe this will come at the very end too, but in terms of a call to action, fortunately, in states like California and New York, we've had state governments that have been starting to invest pretty heavily in trusted messengers, in the community support system. I haven't seen that coming out of the state of Texas. I haven't seen that coming out of the state of Georgia. And these are places, I mean, we just, API data, we just released a national demographics report. Among the fastest growing states that already had a large Asian American population, Texas is one of them, right? Greater than 60% growth between 2010 and 2020 of its Asian American population. So that's something, I think we have to, and especially now we're seeing that states are playing a much bigger role when it comes to policymaking. We have to not only think about this as a national issue, Angela, and thank you for pointing that out, is that in some of the states where this may be the biggest concern is where you're seeing the weakest sustained interest and response from government. And we have to change that.
Yeah, kind of following up on that, Angela, I'm curious, what has been the response of some of the AAPI communities and allies looked like, and has that evolved over time? As you mentioned, there's an inflection point, and then some of it has died down a bit.
So initially there was a lot of interest, a lot of people, a lot of outreach all across the country, a lot of news organizations descending on us, and really good solidarity, people calling each other, and so there was a good kind of connectivity to all of it. But I think amongst people in our community, we are still aware, and thank you, Karthik, for making the point that our government has not done as much as it should, and so people within this community continue to push on it. But primarily, one of the efforts I'm involved in is the launch of a AAPI fund for victims, and we just gave out our first grants to the victims of the shooting in Dallas. But as we kind of push that out more, the idea is that there's going to be the need is there, and there's going to be a quick access to funds, because a lot of these things, the more dramatic things that happen, they're very, very disruptive to people's lives. And we found that there was no kind of national fund to address this. And so I think that's one of the big responses. We've gotten a lot of support for that from corporations and from individuals. So there is still some interest out there, but not as sustained as I would like to see it.
And I think a point that Angela makes that's so important is, the ongoing need for victim services, right? And what Karthik mentioned is important here too, which is that we had an AAPI equity budget in California, in New York, which provides funding for those exact type of resources, right? oftentimes what we're seeing, unfortunately, is disproportionate attention and resources going only to policing, right? And that's why I think the point that I made, I really hope that folks hear it, which is that given that most of what our community is experiencing is not a crime, we need more comprehensive solutions. And we need resources that help people to heal. I will tell you, there's not a single study that indicates that hate crimes enforcement, even where crimes exist, provides any deterrence of future hate crimes. So think of that. If there's not a study that shows that there's a deterrent effect, why are we putting so much in terms of resources there instead of in victim services, right? Because what is going to lead to healing of our communities? It's mental health assistance, right? It's legal resources. We saw, and thank you so much, Angela, for your work in Atlanta, because we heard from communities, from the family members and the survivors, that what they wanted was sometimes help with immigration, sometimes legal assistance, mental health services. And I think that's where we need to focus a lot of our attention moving forward, because that's what's going to help our community to come out of this, not simply increased policing and increased incarceration of individuals, which sadly we've know and come to understand. Stanford law professor Shireen Sinar has found that, in urban areas, often when those hate crimes are prosecuted, they're prosecuted disproportionately against African-American and Latinx young men, as opposed to, again, what our data shows, which is that perpetrators come from all communities.
I think Karthik talked a little bit about what the response has been, maybe on a federal or state level, but could you dig a little bit more into that? Is there anything that you think meaningfully has been done in response to the rise in AAPI hate?
Well, I can start. A lot is being done, actually. I mean, this is a place where I feel really heartened. You have the 2 states with the API equity budgets, but more than that, you have a number of states that have moved forward on either ethnic studies in K through 12 curriculum, like California. Other states have added Asian American studies to their curriculum. That includes Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, and I believe even places like Georgia and Arizona are moving forward with legislation that will provide that inclusion. Also, we see that in the state of California, Stop AAPI Hate actually has what's called the No Place for Hate California platform, which includes a couple of bills that seek to increase safety of ridership in public transit. And we have a bill that really enhances civil rights enforcement in businesses, ensuring that every business have a sign up and that people can use a QR code essentially to report incidents of discrimination to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. I also want to say at the federal level, we've seen in May of this year, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division released guidance, not just on hate crimes enforcement, but on the civil rights enforcement side, all the different mechanisms within federal government that can be used. And there are even grant programs now that have been released so that community-based organizations can apply for funding and create local programming to do what Angela talked about.
Karthik or Angela, would you like to add to that?
And I think one of the other nice things about it is that, I've heard of both of these guys. And so there's sort of like, we're not as siloed in this work, that we all kind of have some kind of connection with each other. Manju, I think you know the executive director of NAPABA, who we've been working with closely on what we're doing. And so there are all these different groups that, grassroots groups that have come up through these incidents and are doing really great work. And so that some of this has been a process of connecting, interesting enough, in the middle of a pandemic, we've all kind of found each other to some degree, and we're all kind of like 2 degrees of separation now. And so that makes me also very hopeful that, that's a very collaborative effort across this country. People doing really great work, and I think that's what we need, is for all of us to kind of put our heads together and continue to move forward.
Definitely. I think, it's great to hear, Manju, about that QR code kind of push, because a big part of this conversation is how little detailed reporting there is of these hate incidents against AAPI individuals. With many of these situations going reported, wondering if that's changing, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly hope that it's changing. I think a fundamental problem we have in the US is that, people often don't understand their rights, and they don't understand what government can do for them, right? That in 45 states, we have a resource guide on our website that shows 45 out of 50 states have their own mechanisms of enforcing civil rights in what's called public accommodations. And that is restaurants, grocery stores, pharmacies, big box retail, and hotels, right? And those definitions, even at the state level, are pretty expansive. There are processes where you can file a complaint, you can get financial redress for what has happened to you, but no one knows that. Why? Because there are no, exciting TV shows about it. What are there instead? There are 500 different NCSIs. There's law and order on every station, for 20 years, right? So that all people know and understand is criminal law enforcement. And that's just not what policing is set up to do. And I think you see too often, unfortunately, as Karthik mentioned before, the ill effects and impacts of policing on communities of color, right? It's not simply Derek Chauvins of the world, but I believe it may have been in Detroit of this, even just this past week, where the police chief apologized because all of the images for target practice were Black men, right? So when you have something like that happen, when you have the infiltration of white supremacist and white nationalist groups in law enforcement, the Southern Poverty Law Center has studied and issued reports on this. You have what we're seeing now. And I'm actually very worried moving forward in terms of policing, because we now have many states that have outlawed abortion. Are police now going to arrest women and girls, right, as young as 10 or 11 for trying to get an abortion? Is that what police are going to be in the business of doing? So I think it's really time to sort of interrogate what systems are well-resourced in our country and what systems aren't, and go about changing that. Because I'll tell you, in many instances, when an AAPI individual is called the police, because they were, discriminated against at Walmart or CVS, the police come and say, there's nothing we can do. And they're right, because we don't put salespeople behind bars for discrimination. We have civil rights laws to address that if more people know and understand, and we have lawyers within government who will prosecute those cases.
Just a quick thing I'll say, and I know that we're running out of time a bit, but in terms of disaggregation or detailed ethnicity data, this has been part of an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander agenda for over, almost 4 decades now. And the reason why it's so important is that we do have significant differences in our community, different times in history, different communities that are affected by hate incidents and issues. But even going beyond that, understanding whether government agencies, from school districts to police departments to libraries, et cetera, are adequately serving their population, just saying Asian or API isn't going to cut it. But it's so it's plain as day to see why you need to collect that data. But there's all sorts of inertia and resistance that communities have found over time. Some of them that is so frustrating to me is people saying, well, we can't change our databases. It's like, really? Like it's going to cost you a certain amount of money to change, add some additional fields, right? Or maybe add an additional question, right? To be able to understand what kind of Asian are you. I'm being a little blunt in the way I say this, but it's infuriating because without that kind of detailed data collection, we don't understand the kinds of issues that affect our community more broadly across different ethnic groups and the kinds of things that are more pressing for certain communities. So for example, language access. We know from American Community Survey data that groups like Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans need more language assistance, including those that you might think of as well off. They may have high incomes and still need language assistance. Whereas, for groups like Indian Americans and Pakistani Americans, you have less language needs. So that's why it's so important for government agencies to not only disaggregate data by race and to make sure that they're collecting data on Asian and Pacific Islander, but also to further break down that data within our communities.
That slides into the next question quite nicely, Karthik. So, we've been using a lot of terminology like Asian Americans and AAPI, and it can sound like we're talking about a singular group. Of course, we know that this community is not monolithic. So is there a productive way of talking about this without overgeneralizing, either, in a vernacular sense or in a data sense?
So quick thing I'll just say on this is, people ask, so are you guys one group or many groups? And the answer is, you can either say it depends, but the answer is both of those are true, right? So and this is why it's actually important to do disaggregated data collections to understand what are the conditions under which the community is solidified and what are the conditions in which it may be apart. So when it comes to language needs, dramatic differences in the community. When it comes to income inequality, socioeconomic status, dramatic differences. I've been fortunate enough to be collecting public opinion data for well over a decade now. Remarkable solidarity on increased taxes, more social services, support for gun control, support for environmental protection, support for a pathway to citizenship. So it's so important for us to collect the data in a disaggregated way and then to let the evidence show when are we together and when are we either apart or different and have different needs. The answer is not, we are so diverse that everything has to be custom tailored. Because then, when you're a government agency official, it's like, wait a second, you're here under this API umbrella, but all of you are so different. Why should I listen to you? I should only listen to the representatives of community X and community Y. There are coalitions and data which show that a remarkable amount of solidarity across issues. And so that's why it's not inconsistent to say that we are diverse and unified at the same time.
And just slide now into audience Q&A actually. So we do have a question for you guys. They ask, is there a class element specific to the way some Asian Americans are treated as it relates to this topic? If so, is it possible to generalize why?
So I can speak very specifically to that question. We did a survey with the Edelman firm last fall, and we actually found a few different things. One was that 1 out of 5 individuals who took our survey said that they had experienced some form of hate or discrimination. The other piece, though, was that, in fact, low-income individuals experienced it at higher levels. So that's really noteworthy in terms of, I think, it's not something that's been examined in detail, but I think worth taking a look at. And, those issues which I think, we saw in Atlanta, which, Karthik alluded to earlier, with that individuals often who are low income, have some of the greatest challenges, right, in terms of some of the language access pieces, immigration, the need for legal assistance, et cetera. And so I think this is something that we need to examine more thoroughly and really determine then what are some of those solutions. I will tell you, in terms of, a few of those bills I mentioned earlier, they will have impacts on low-income individuals, because when you see, individuals who take public transit, often it is those who can't necessarily afford a car or even a ride-hailing service. So buses, trains are so important, right, in ensuring public safety there. And similarly, all of us, right, are shopping to basically provide for our families. But for those low-income individuals, if they're experiencing the hate and the harassment at higher levels, then obviously that makes their challenges even greater than those who can perhaps choose more readily where they shop or where they take their dollars.
I think that's a great question. And I think sort of just, it speaks to how the most vulnerable in our community have been primarily the victims. It's older people, it's women, it's it's people not in vehicles, based like as Manju said. So I really think that there probably is some, if we sift the data, that that you'll probably see that there's some trends, and they just speak to so income level would just speak to another aspect of being a vulnerable person.
Yeah, the thing I want to caution though, folks, is that these are tendencies. Right. So, of course, there are upper middle class Asian Americans that are being targeted. And one thing I'll just say, going back to that historical perspective, is, is this notion of middle minorities. And, I think especially with a venue like this, I mean, this has been the charge against the Jewish diaspora in many parts of the world. And this is something that Asians have found themselves in many parts of the world, where you have, like this shopkeeper class or this merchant class, or people who are in a certain class position that is not at the top in terms of access to power, and yet have been framed in a way of divide and rule or divide and conquer, if you will. And in fact, what you see from time to time is class pressures and racial, religious, and ethnic pressures that are weaponized by those in power to attack the middle class, this middle minority, right? And so that, and especially if they have markers of foreignness, it becomes easier for them to become targets. And so we've seen that. We've seen that historically. I mean, the examples that Angela talks about, from the 1800s in California and Colorado to today, that's where it comes from too. So there is a different kind of class element that I think we should just be very, very mindful of, when it comes to hate incidents.
Well, I appreciate those answers. It was the most holistic response to that class question I think a lot of us have been asking. So we have another Q&A question from the audience. What is the current immigration situation for Asians? Are we still seeing discriminatory policies in this area?
One quick thing I'll just say on this. So API data, we just released this national report, and you can just go to apidata.com/reports. If you look at the Department of Homeland Security data, we've seen a decline in the number of green cards that have been issued across the board, and certainly it affects Asian Americans as well. That's one of the things that I think coming out of the pandemic and even seeing things like labor shortages and runaway inflation, we have not fully appreciated how much immigration slowed down under the Trump administration before COVID, and what we need to do to get back to a healthy level of immigration in this country. And that's something that I hope that there's greater public awareness and ultimately congressional oversight and greater investments. I mean, USCIS is seen as a self-financed agency, and it is not doing its job. The kind of backlogs are just enormous when it comes to naturalization and when it comes to green card issuance, and that affects Asian American communities tremendously. So that's something that I think, when we think about exclusionary practices, going back to this theme of it's not just what happens in civil society, it also what happens through the levers of government. And we just need to be very cognizant of that and figure out what does it take to get back to an America that, that reflects our highest ideals.
I think, immigration is one of those issues that historically has had bipartisan support because it's good for this country. I mean, demographically, our country does a lot better than other countries because of immigration. And that, supports our economy. And there are a lot of different, myriad benefits to immigration for us and for other countries that welcome immigration. But, right now with where some of the people on the right are, like, it's just, they can't touch it. And so that's the depressing reality of it, is that even if people in power know that it's, immigration reform is good for the country and immigrants are good for the country, that it's almost like you can't even talk about it. So it's just, it's something that politically I think is very shut down.
Well, and I'll add to that, I mean, part of the reason they can't talk about it or do anything about it is because of the hate they themselves have inspired. So we should be clear as to why, if they gin up their electorate to hate brown and Black people, then it should come to no one's surprise that there are not then freer or more open immigration laws, because they themselves have caused that to happen. Let me say, on the other side of the immigration piece, unfortunately, we saw it under Trump, even Obama, and now under President Biden, is immigration enforcement that is targeting our communities, specifically those in Southeast Asian communities, Vietnamese and Cambodian, who have been deported en masse in different ways based on often what are petty crimes they committed in their youth. So there have been a number of individuals in the Los Angeles area whom we've tried to advocate for against deportation. In some cases, we've gotten pardons for them so that they are no longer eligible for deportation. But otherwise, what's happening is the US government is going after these individuals who often are, my age, in their late 40s, early 50s, but had committed a crime when they were 17, 18, 19, often because they lived in areas that had, gang penetration. And so they took part in these illicit activities, but ignoring the fact that they have families now, they run businesses, they are tax-paying Americans, and yet they are now being sent to countries that they really have not been in since they were infants. So I want us to think about ways in which even under the Biden administration, that is continuing to take place.
Yeah, I think Manju, critical point there. People might think, oh, these are undocumented immigrants. No, these are like people on refugee status and on green cards, right? And who committed these crimes, while they had different kinds of legal statuses. So it's not just something that's it's an undocumented immigrant issue.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Thank you for mentioning that. And while we're talking about undocumented individuals, let me add that 1 out of 10 AAPIs or Asian Americans specifically is undocumented. So people don't often think of Asian Americans as being in that category, but there's a large number of our community members who are undocumented and came to the United States without papers and continue to live here and contribute just alongside Latinx communities, but without programs like DACA and others, really are vulnerable to essentially any administration that seeks to deport them in large numbers.
We do have another question. They ask, with COVID's numbers dangerously increasing in many parts of the country, Dallas has just raised its warning level. Do you see potential for an increase in anti-Asian hatred?
Unfortunately, we do. We even saw this actually, in some waves, though, I mean, we're still looking at and analyzing the data, and I don't know if Karthik might have insights on this as well. When there was the increase in the Delta variant, we heard certainly anecdotally that individuals who identified and were perceived as South Asian were being targeted because of the potential origins of COVID, of that variant Delta coming from India. So yes, I think we are concerned about that. And we know actually even beyond COVID itself, unfortunately, the hate that we are seeing now is really like that genie in the bottle, which is once you let it out, it's very hard to put it back. And I think with the other aspects of sort of white nationalism and white supremacy that are really overtaking our nation in extremely dangerous ways, we're going to continue to see anti-Asian and anti-AAPI hate, whether or not it's in the headlines.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly to that. I mean, actually, Manju, I think the fact that you have more time-specific data, like that's a good kind of leverage to kind of see those spikes. But absolutely, I mean, I think it's some of it, you can see that responsiveness, but it's part of this more general trend, right, in terms of white nationalism or xenophobia, whatever dynamic you're talking about. And this is why you can also see other communities, including Latinx communities. You might say, well, what does COVID have to do with hate incidents against Latinos? But it's part of this more general engine of, again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, of defining American in ethno-religious terms. And then, so it's not even something that's very intellectual here. It plays out in people saying, go back to your country, or just beating someone up because of the way they look or the accent that they have. And that's really troubling. And so I don't want to both acknowledge that there may be real world occurrences that might allow us to predict spikes in some of these things, but that there is this more underlying dynamic that Manju talked about, this kind of genie that's out, but it's really tapping this really kind of this element of American history that rears itself from time to time, and we have to commit ourselves to fighting back against those forces.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that for the first time in recent memory, that somehow this kind of anti-anybody but, kind of white Christian, that sort of bundled into patriotism. Like I had not seen that before, and that's what's kind of shocking, upsetting, is that that's sort of wrapped into some sort of like patriotism, which is really bizarre. But I really that I think that did originate with the Trump presidency and really has taken off, and to me that's part of that genie that's been that is out of the bottle, that it's sort of acceptable because it's like, well, I'm being patriotic, when I'm being anti everybody else. And it's shocking and terrifying.
Yeah, and if I may add, Liz, when we did a report in 2020, and we're going to repeat that again now in September, looking at the nativist rhetoric, the anti-China rhetoric, we found that 28% of the incidents involve that same language that was used, again, not just by President Trump, but by so many other of our political leaders. And that includes, what Karthik mentioned, go back to your country. It includes Wuhan virus, Kung flu. And so many of these different sentiments really were things that were weaponized by these political leaders for their own political gain, and actually then did result in harm to everyday Americans of Asian American and Pacific Islander origin. So literally those words were putting people in harm's way day in and day out in 2020. And we believe that, from preliminary evidence that we're going to see something very similar when we issue, those findings again this year.
Got you. And I really appreciate this final question that we have from the audience. So they ask, what does credible allyship look like, both within AAPI communities and outside of AAPI communities? How can we help stop these hate incidents? Angela, do you want to start first?
Sure. I mean, I think anyone who approaches this with sincerity, and real interest, I think that's where it starts. When the people that are in the Zoom, that are taking an interest in this issue, and reading articles about, reading books about it, and like during the summer of George Floyd, I picked up a bunch of books that, like Cast and things like that, where I think if you approach these topics with sensitivity, thoughtfulness, and sincerity, that that's where it starts, and kind of let that lead you. So that's what I believe, and I think there are a lot of people that really have taken an interest in and ownership of these issues. Like if something is happening to the Black community, something's happening to the Jewish community, that's my issue too, right? And I think that if we took more collective ownership of these things, that we're just going to be that much closer to solving some of them.
Perfect. What about you? Or Manju?
Well, I can just say very quickly, honestly, this series is a really good example of that solidarity and allyship, right? As Mary Pat was saying at the outset, that essentially, the series was started after the killing of George Floyd, when the community saw that there was a need for this kind of dialogue. So I think, dialogue is absolutely the first step. And then, as Angela mentioned, there's that need for collective action, right? Because individually, we are not going to solve this problem. I can't go up to every single person, right? It wouldn't even be safe for me to do so and say, stop hating on us, right? Or don't do that, or what you did is hateful and discriminatory. But what can help is having appropriate policies. Garthik and AAPI Data have done tremendous work in providing information about civic engagement and where there are those gaps in our communities. But I would just say for all of us right now, the fact we see from the hearings regarding January 6th, we see from the recent Supreme Court decisions, and even more importantly, in terms of the docket for next time, a real undoing of what is a short-lived multiracial democracy. We've only been doing this, honestly, since 1965, right? But yet, even still, it is slipping through our fingers with speed and ferocity that we've not seen in our lifetimes. So I think if we really, part of allyship is addressing these issues that our specific communities are facing. And part of the allyship is really about taking collective action to ensure our democracy in the future. I mean, I just can't say it more strongly. Democracy is not a spectator sport, so we need everyone out on the field with their shin guards and their boots on to be in the fight with us.
Manju said it more eloquently than I could, so I'm just gonna leave my response alone.
The one thing I'll add to that, maybe our panelists are too humble to say this, but I mean, I think a great place to start is to go back to some of the things that they referenced about their work. follow AAPI data, Stop Asian Hate AAPI, go to their social media accounts and follow them, and just follow their work and stay in touch with what they're doing. Go to the victims funds that Angela referenced. And I think that's always a great starting point and to spread out from there. I just want to say a special thank you to our panelists. As a journalist, I use a lot of your work to inform so we can inform the community. And I just want to thank you again for sharing your expertise with us. And also thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us on August 4th for our final session of the series as we look to the future. And we just want to say good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.